The morning of Elena Vasquez's wedding began with a lie sitting quietly inside an envelope. She had not slept much the night before. Not because she was nervous in the way brides are supposed to be nervous, with hearts fluttering over first dances and flower arrangements, but because something had been pressing against her chest for weeks, something she could not quite name. She had told herself it was nothing. She had told herself that every woman feels this way before a wedding. She had told herself, more times than she could count, that Alaric Montclair was a good man, and that she was lucky, and that the life stretching out in front of her was exactly what she had hoped for. She had said all of this to herself so many times that she had almost started to believe it. Elena was 28 years old. She had grown up in a home that was warm in the ways that mattered and stretched thin in the ways that were harder to ignore. Her father, Gerald Vasquez, had spent his life running a small property firm that had once done well and had then, quietly and over a number of years, done less well. He was proud and honest and had never once made Elena feel like a burden, but she had grown old enough to understand numbers on a page, and she knew what it meant when the numbers kept going in the wrong direction. Her mother, a calm and soft-spoken woman named Marguerite, had managed the household with the practiced grace of someone who has learned to make things look easy because the alternative is too exhausting to consider. They were a family who loved each other and who did not speak about money except when they had to, and who therefore spoke about money more often than any of them would have preferred. Elena had grown up watching her parents love each other with the steady, unshowy warmth of people who had chosen well and knew it. That had not made her romantic in a naive way. If anything, it had made her precise about what she wanted, clear about the difference between the surface of a thing and its interior. She was not the kind of person who could be dazzled for long. She had excellent instincts, and she had spent the better part of a year choosing, very deliberately, not to use them. Alaric had arrived in her life through the kind of introduction that still happens in certain circles. Quiet dinners where two families sit across from each other and speak about everything except the actual point of the evening. He was 34, tall in the way that photographs well, with dark hair that was always perfectly placed and a smile that landed on his face like something practiced but convincing. He had inherited a large portion of his wealth from his grandfather and had grown it through property and private finance, working with the particular confidence of a man who has never had to wonder whether the room will receive him well. He moved through the world with ease. He was, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of man a family in a certain kind of difficulty might hope for. Elena had watched him across that first dinner table and had not felt her heart race. She had felt something quieter than that, something more like relief, which she later understood was not the same thing at all. Relief is what you feel when a problem appears to be resolving. It is not what you feel when something good has arrived. She had filed the distinction away and chosen not to draw the obvious conclusion from it. They had spent 7 months together before the engagement. 7 months of dinners at restaurants where the menus had no prices, of weekend trips to coastal towns where the hotels were small and expensive, of theater evenings and gallery openings where Alaric moved through rooms the way people move when they are very comfortable being looked at. He knew a great many people. He was generous in the early weeks, attentive in the way that requires effort rather than feeling, the way that eventually becomes exhausting to maintain because effort and feeling are not the same fuel. He remembered small things she mentioned, or at least he appeared to, and there were moments when she had looked at him and thought that perhaps this was what mature love felt like. Not fireworks but steadiness. Not passion but partnership. She had wanted very much for that to be true. Her cousin Nina had told her differently. Nina was 3 years older than Elena, the kind of woman who says the thing no one else will say and then waits, without apology, for the room to catch up. She was a financial analyst who approached most situations, including personal ones, with the same level of clear-eyed assessment she applied to balance sheets. She did not have Alaric Montclair's kind of charm and she did not trust people who did, not as a rule but as a precaution earned through observation. She had spent the first 3 months of Elena's relationship with Alaric making her own quiet assessments from the outside and not yet saying what she found. Then one evening, after a dinner where Alaric had been particularly charming and everyone around the table had seemed to find him wonderful and Elena had watched it all with the expression of someone very slightly removed from their own life, Nina had pulled Elena aside in the kitchen under the pretense of helping with coffee, and she had spoken. She said she had heard a name connected to him. A woman named Celeste. A socialite who moved in the same world Alaric moved in, who had been seen at his side at events for 2 years before Elena appeared, and who, according to sources Nina trusted, had not entirely disappeared from his life. She said she was telling Elena not to cause trouble but because she believed Elena deserved to make her decisions with full information. Elena had listened to every word. She had stood with a coffee cup in each hand and she had listened, and her face had not changed very much, because Elena's face did not change very much when she was taking in something difficult. That was how she processed things. Quietly, internally, without performance. She had thanked Nina. She had carried the cups back to the table. She had sat beside Alaric and watched him be charming for the rest of the evening. That night she had gone home and lain in bed staring at the ceiling for a very long time. And then she had decided that Nina was wrong. Or perhaps not wrong, but speaking about the past, about something that had already ended. Alaric was marrying her. He had chosen her. He had stood in Gerald Vasquez's sitting room with a ring and a speech that was not poetic but was sincere, and her father had shaken his hand with a relief so visible it was almost painful to observe, and Elena had seen that look on her father's face and had felt the full weight of what it meant. She had pushed Nina's words into a corner of her mind and built a small wall around them. That wall had required constant maintenance. There had been evenings when Alaric's phone lit up on the dining table and he turned it face down with a movement so smooth it seemed rehearsed. There had been a charity function 3 months into the engagement where Elena had noticed a woman across the room watching Alaric with a particular kind of attention. Not the attention of a stranger admiring a handsome man, but the focused, proprietary attention of someone who knows exactly how a person moves through a room because they have watched them do it many times. Elena had asked about her afterward, casually, framing it as idle curiosity, and Alaric had said she was a family friend, and Elena had nodded, and the small wall in her mind had required several more bricks that evening. She had kept building it. She was good at maintenance. It was, she later thought, one of her less useful skills. The wedding had been planned over 8 months. Elena had thrown herself into every detail with the kind of focused energy she usually brought to work, which was project management for a mid-size architecture firm where she was known for being thorough, organized and very difficult to rattle. She had chosen the cathedral not for its grandeur but because she had walked through it as a teenager on a school trip and had felt something real there, something in the quality of the late afternoon light through its stone windows that had stayed with her across the years in the way that certain spaces do. She had selected flowers that were not fashionable but that she actually loved, white peonies with trailing green stems, nothing too arranged, nothing that looked like it had been constructed by someone with a concept. She had found a dress that she did not share photographs of online, not out of secrecy but because the dress felt personal in a way she wanted to keep to herself. She had found a veil at the back of her mother's wardrobe. Marguerite had worn it at her own wedding 40 years before, and it was slightly yellowed at the edges and infinitely more precious to Elena than any of the purchased things surrounding the day. She had believed, throughout all of this planning, that she was preparing for a real marriage. Not a perfect one. She had never asked for perfect. She had asked for genuine, for honest, for the specific and ordinary miracle of 2 people choosing each other with their eyes open and building something together from that choice. She had been planning that life, in parallel with planning the wedding, in the careful mental way she planned everything, thinking about the house and the routines and the way the mornings might feel, 2 people moving through a shared space with the accumulated ease of people who have made their decision and are at peace with it. She had been planning it right up until the morning of the wedding. She had woken before the alarm, as she always did when she was holding something in her mind she was not entirely at peace with. She had sat on the edge of the hotel bed in the early morning stillness and she had sat with the feeling for a while, identifying it, allowing it to be there without rushing to name it as anxiety or excitement or nerves. It was something more specific than any of those. It was the feeling of a person who has maintained something at great effort for a long time and who has woken up in the morning and found that the maintenance has become, overnight, exhausting. She had dressed. She had sat in the chair while Caroline arranged her hair. She had let the morning move forward the way mornings do when there is a plan and a schedule and a building full of people who are collectively expecting something. And then the folder had arrived. It was brought up by a member of the venue's events team, a polite young man with a clipboard who left it on the side table without ceremony and moved on to the next task on his list. It was the final seating chart, cross-referenced with the confirmed guest list, a document Elena had approved in its earlier form 2 weeks prior. She had been expecting to glance at it, confirm that nothing significant had shifted, and set it aside. Caroline had stepped out for more hairpins. Nina had gone to refresh her coffee. Elena had picked up the document with one hand while looking at something else, and she had begun running her eyes down the columns of names with the same efficient, lateral attention she used on spreadsheets at work, not reading so much as scanning, moving through the familiar architecture of names, family on one side, Alaric's circle on the other, the symmetry of 2 lives being formally combined. She had stopped. Row 2. Right side. Front of the cathedral. Celeste Drummond. Elena had stood very still. She had read the name again. She had looked at the position on the chart, at the precise placement, and she had understood immediately what it meant. Row 2, right side, was not where you placed a casual acquaintance. It was not a seat for a business colleague or a peripheral social contact accommodated as a courtesy. Row 2, right side was 4 seats from Alaric's family. It was the seating arrangement of a person whose presence is being quietly declared. It was the kind of placement that required an active decision, a deliberate choice made by a man who was, at this moment, downstairs putting on a suit and a white flower and preparing to stand at an altar. Elena had set the document down on the table with both hands, very carefully, the way you set down something you need to hold without touching. She had looked at the window. Outside, the city was proceeding through an ordinary morning. People were walking to work and to coffee and to the 10,000 appointments of their lives, completely indifferent to the fact that a woman in an ivory silk dress was standing in a hotel suite on the 4th floor holding the seating chart for her own wedding and understanding something she had been building a wall against for 11 months. She had stood there for what felt like a long time but was probably 20 seconds. Then she had sat down in the chair. She had placed her hands flat on her thighs. She had breathed in and breathed out and let the information settle into its proper place, where it could be assessed clearly rather than felt urgently. Caroline came back with the pins. Nina came back with the coffee. Elena said nothing. She waited until Caroline had finished and moved into the next room. Then she looked at Nina, who had already read something in her stillness that others would have missed. Elena picked up the document and held it out so that Nina could see row 2, right side. Nina looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, quietly and without drama, the way she said things that mattered, "Tell me you are not going down there." Elena looked at her mother's veil, folded on the table like something that had been waiting. She thought about Gerald in his pressed suit in the antechamber downstairs. She thought about Marguerite in her good dress in the pew. She thought about 8 months of planning and 7 months of relationship and 11 months of carefully maintained wall. She thought about what it would mean to walk away from the cathedral, and what it would mean not to. Then she stood up. She said to Nina, "Yes. I am." Nina stared at her for a long moment, reading her face with the precision she had spent 31 years developing. Then she put down her coffee cup. Elena placed her mother's veil on her head. She picked up the white peonies from the table. She stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself, briefly and without sentiment, the way you look at something you need to assess rather than admire. She opened the door. Nina followed without another word, which was the most significant thing she could have done. They took the elevator down together. Elena watched the numbers change above the doors and thought about nothing except what she was going to do in the next 20 minutes and how she was going to do it. She had made her decision. The decision was made, and now it was simply a matter of execution, which was something she had always been good at. Gerald was in the antechamber in his dark suit, his hands folded in front of him with the particular stillness of a man who is very nervous and who is not going to show it. When he saw Elena come through the door, he looked at her face, and something shifted in his expression, the slightest rearrangement, a father reading his daughter the way only fathers can. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not ask anything. He offered her his arm. She took it. They stood together at the entrance to the nave. The music started. The doors opened. And Elena Vasquez, with her father's arm beneath her hand and her mother's veil on her hair and her own mind entirely clear, walked into the light. She had given herself one rule before she stepped through those cathedral doors. She was not going to look for Celeste Drummond. She was going to walk the full length of the aisle, take her position at the altar, look Alaric in the eye, and then know what she was going to do. She kept the rule for perhaps 12 seconds. Then she saw the ivory. It was not a subtle color in a building full of guests in blue and gray and soft green. Ivory announced itself the moment an eye moved across it. Elena's eye moved across it and corrected, because the chart had said row 2, right side, and she looked to row 2, right side, and there she was. Celeste Drummond was a woman who understood very precisely how to occupy a space. She was perhaps 32, with the kind of appearance that speaks of sustained and particular investment, carefully maintained in the way that requires both money and the steady conviction that the investment is worthwhile. Her dress was not white and not cream. It existed in the deliberate middle ground where someone wearing it might claim either depending on who was asking, and it was beautifully constructed, and it was absolutely the wrong color to wear to another woman's wedding. This was not an accident. No woman with Celeste Drummond's level of social awareness put on a dress like that to attend the wedding of the man she had spent 3 years beside and made an accidental color choice. Elena saw all of this in approximately 3 seconds, in the same clinical and rapid way she assessed situations at work when a project had gone wrong and she needed to understand the full scope of the problem before she opened her mouth. She kept walking. Her father's arm was steady. Gerald Vasquez had spent a lifetime learning how to be present for the people he loved without requiring them to manage him in the process, and he was present now in the fullest sense, his pace matching hers exactly, his posture calm, his face carrying the composed expression of a man who does not know everything that is happening but who trusts the person walking beside him. The cathedral was genuinely beautiful. Elena noticed this the way you notice weather when you are standing outside with something more pressing on your mind. The light came through the high windows in angled columns that shifted across the stone floor as the clouds moved. The white peonies at the end of each row were exactly as she had requested. The music was the piece she had chosen herself, something unhurried and serious on the organ. Every guest had risen, 200 people who had come from various places for a morning they thought they understood, and Elena could feel their attention on her, the specific quality of being watched in a crowd, but she allowed it to be peripheral. She was looking at the altar. Alaric was standing there in a well-made dark suit with a white flower at his lapel, and he was watching her come toward him with an expression she recognized from their first months together. The practiced version of warmth. The smile that appeared in the right place a half-second after it would have appeared if it had been genuine. She had spent months convincing herself she was wrong about that half-second. Standing now in the nave of a cathedral with 200 people watching and her mother's veil over her hair, she was not convinced of anything except the truth of what she had always known. She reached the altar. Gerald pressed her hand and stepped back. The officiant smiled at the congregation in the way that officiants smile when they have done this many times and are comfortable with the rhythm of it. Elena stood opposite Alaric Montclair and looked at his face. He leaned very slightly toward her. He said, in the low, private way of someone performing intimacy, "You look beautiful." She looked at him. She said nothing. He must have read something in her silence, because the expression on his face shifted almost imperceptibly. Not collapse, not fear. Just a very slight recalibration, a man who has read a situation incorrectly and is in the process of noticing. The officiant began to speak. The opening of a wedding ceremony, the words about gathering and occasion and the significance of the moment, is a kind of script that most people in the building have heard before and which creates the particular suspended warmth of ritual. Elena stood in that warmth and let it proceed around her, and she thought clearly about what she knew and what she had decided and what she was about to do. Then she reached up and lifted her veil. Brides lift their veils at weddings. This alone was not remarkable. But Elena did not lift her veil as a prelude to anything the ceremony had planned. She lifted it, folded it carefully back over her head with both hands, and then turned to face the congregation rather than the officiant. It was a small physical movement. It changed the entire meaning of the morning. The shift was immediate and total. The officiant stopped mid-sentence. Alaric went absolutely still. In the front rows, faces changed. Nina, standing to the side in her position as witness, had gone motionless. Gerald, behind Elena to the right, had dropped his head by a fraction, the posture of a man who has understood. In row 2, on the right side, Celeste Drummond stopped breathing. Elena looked out at the full cathedral. She could see Alaric's family in the front row, his mother in lavender, his father with the same set to the jaw that Alaric had. She could see her own family opposite, her aunts, her cousin children in their small good clothes, 2 friends who had traveled significant distances to be here on this morning. She could see 200 faces looking back at her with the collective attention of people who understand, with some animal instinct, that something unusual is happening and that they should be very quiet. She looked, once, at Celeste Drummond. Not for long. Not with anger or with the trembling heat of humiliation. With simple recognition. One person confirming what she already knew about another. Then she looked away. She said, in a voice that was completely level and completely clear, carrying without effort through the silence of the stone building, I want to thank every person in this room for coming today. I know many of you have traveled a great distance, and I know that many of you care deeply about what happens in this cathedral this morning. I want you to know that means more to me than I can say. The silence was absolute. The kind of silence that exists only in very large enclosed spaces when every person inside them is holding their breath. I also want you to know, Elena said, with exactly the same tone, not louder, not quieter, that I will not be getting married today. The silence held for 1 full second after those words. Then it broke. Not all at once but in the particular spreading wave of 200 people absorbing the same information and beginning to process it. A breath. A murmur. The soft, collective sound of understanding arriving. Alaric said her name. He said it tightly, with the controlled urgency of a man trying to close a door that is already open. Elena did not look at him. She looked instead at the small girl who had carried the flowers up the aisle, a cousin's daughter, 7 years old, standing to the left with her basket held in both hands and her eyes very wide and her expression the expression of a child who does not entirely understand what is happening but who knows that it is important. Elena bent down slightly and held out her bouquet. The girl took it. She held it carefully with both hands, looking up. Elena smiled at her. It was genuine and warm and completely at odds with everything happening around it, and it was the truest thing that happened in the cathedral that morning. Then Elena straightened her back, turned to face the long aisle, and walked it. Not quickly. Not with any of the physical urgency that embarrassment produces. She walked at the same pace she had walked in, measured and unhurried, with her head level and her shoulders back and her mother's veil still on her hair, and the only sound in the cathedral was the quiet movement of her dress on the stone floor and the faint echo of her footsteps in the high space above. 200 people watched her go. She reached the great doors at the end of the nave. She passed through them. She stepped out into the morning. The doors closed behind her with a sound that was not dramatic, that had no particular music to it. It was simply the sound of two large doors settling back into their frame. But inside the cathedral, in the quality of the silence that followed it, that sound was the most complete thing any of them had heard in a very long time. Alaric had not moved. He was standing at the altar in his well-made suit with the white flower at his lapel and the officiant beside him and 200 guests in the pews, and for perhaps 10 or 15 seconds he stood exactly where he was, because there are moments when the gap between what a person expected to happen and what has actually happened is wide enough that the mind requires time to cross it. Around him, the cathedral was beginning to make noise again. Not the warm, celebratory noise of a wedding, but the particular low murmur of people speaking to each other in the tone reserved for things they have not anticipated. In row 2, on the right side, Celeste Drummond had gone completely still. The color in her face had changed. Around her, people who had spent a few seconds registering what had just happened were beginning to do something else, something quieter and more considered. They were doing arithmetic. They were looking at the placement of the woman in ivory in the second row, and they were looking at the empty space where the bride had been standing, and they were adding the two together, and the sum was arriving clearly and without ambiguity. It was not a comfortable thing to be in the second row under those circumstances. Gerald Vasquez sat in his pew with his hands on his knees and his chin raised by a precise and dignified quarter-inch. The expression on his face was complicated in the way that a father's face is always complicated when he is watching his child do something very hard. There was pain in it and there was pride in it and there was something else, something underneath both of those, that was the specific feeling of a father who has watched his daughter read a situation correctly and act on it, and who understands that what she has just cost herself in order to do that is not small. Nina had not moved either. She was still standing where she had been standing as witness, looking at the great doors at the far end of the cathedral, which had just closed. Her jaw was set. Her hands were flat at her sides. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been afraid of a particular outcome for 11 months and has just been told, in the clearest possible way, that the outcome they feared is not going to happen. Outside, on the cathedral steps, Elena stood alone in the clear morning light with her mother's veil still on her hair and no bouquet in her hands. A car was waiting at the curb. She had arranged it the night before, quietly, in the hour after she had gone back over the seating chart for the third time and allowed herself to acknowledge, fully and without the wall, what it said. She walked down the steps. She got in. The driver pulled smoothly away from the cathedral and into the ordinary flow of the Saturday morning street. Elena sat in the back seat and looked out the window and said nothing. She took out her phone. She found the number. She dialed. The call was answered on the second ring. She said, "I would like to make an appointment as soon as possible. Today, if there is any availability." The voice on the other end asked a few brief questions. Then confirmed a time. Elena thanked them and ended the call. She sat back in the seat. She reached up and unpinned her mother's veil with careful hands, taking the pins out one by one, and then she folded the fabric slowly and precisely and held it in her lap with both hands for the rest of the drive. She thought about what she would need to say to Francis Okafor, and what she would need to bring, and she began composing the conversation in her mind with the same methodical precision she brought to every difficult task. She knew what she was owed. She had always known, in the quiet, uncelebrated way of someone who understands their own value without requiring others to confirm it. The question was never what she deserved. The question had always been whether she was going to demand it. The car crossed the bridge and she watched the water below, gray-green in the morning light, and she thought about her mother's veil in her lap and what it had meant to choose it rather than something new and purchased. She thought about Marguerite, who had pressed it for her 2 weeks before the wedding with the careful attention of someone handling something that matters. She thought about what it would mean to call her mother this afternoon and tell her what had happened. She would not soften it. Marguerite did not require softening. She was a woman who had managed hard things with quiet dignity for 40 years and who would receive hard news in the same way she received everything, steadily and without theater, and who would then, in her own time, say the right thing. Elena trusted this about her the way she trusted very few things absolutely. She thought about her father's face in the antechamber, the expression he had worn when he looked at her and read what was there, and the choice he had made in that moment to offer his arm without asking a single question. Gerald Vasquez in his pressed suit, steady and present, asking nothing except to be useful. She loved him more in that memory than she had words for. The car turned onto the familiar street near her flat, and she watched the buildings and the morning people and the ordinary motion of a city that was doing what cities do, which is continue, regardless, and she found this, as she usually did, more comforting than ominous. She was going to be all right. She had known this since the car pulled away from the cathedral. Perhaps she had known it before that, in the moment she put down the seating chart on the table in the hotel suite and stood at the window and let the knowledge settle. There is a specific kind of calm that comes when you have stopped fighting what you know to be true, and she had felt it then, and she felt it now, sitting in the back seat with her mother's veil in her hands and the rest of her life arranging itself quietly ahead of her. Not easily. She did not expect it to be easy. There would be a great deal that was hard and a great deal that required rebuilding and a great deal of the particular loneliness that follows the end of something, even something that was not right. She knew all of this. She was not arriving at some uncomplicated version of freedom. She was arriving at the harder and more honest version, the one that required work and clarity and the willingness to begin again without guarantees. She was good at beginning. It was, when she thought about it clearly, one of the things she did best. She reached up and unpinned her mother's veil with careful hands, taking the pins out one by one, and then she folded the fabric slowly and precisely and held it in her lap with both hands for the rest of the drive. She had a meeting with a lawyer at 3 o'clock. She was not going to be late. The first call Alaric Montclair made after the cathedral was to his older brother, Frederick. Frederick was driving back from the reception venue when his phone rang, which meant he had not yet heard what happened, and so he answered in the ordinary voice of a man expecting an update. And within 30 seconds the voice on the other end had removed any expectation of ordinary from the morning. Alaric was not a man who lost his composure easily. He had built a life, a public life and a private one, on the steady ability to manage the impression he made, to read what a room required of him and supply it efficiently. He knew how to be the most confident person in a difficult conversation. He knew how to absorb bad news without letting it show. He had been, by his own assessment and others, very good at navigating situations that would have unmade less self-possessed men. What Frederick heard in his brother's voice that morning was something he had never heard before. It was not grief and it was not anger, though there were elements of both. It was the specific and disorienting sound of a person who had prepared for a particular day and found that the day had gone somewhere completely different, and who did not have the tools for the terrain they were now in. Frederick pulled over to the side of the road. He listened for 5 minutes without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. Then he said, very carefully, "Go home, Alaric. Go home and we will speak this evening." Alaric went home. The house was large and very quiet in the middle of the afternoon. It was a house designed to be impressive rather than comfortable, with high ceilings and rooms that felt curated rather than lived in, rooms that had been furnished to signal something about the person who occupied them. In several rooms there were small arrangements Elena had placed the day before, a detail she had organized as part of the plan for the morning after the wedding, fresh flowers in the hallway, a set of things folded on a counter in the kitchen. Alaric walked past these without registering them the first time, and then doubled back and stood looking at the flowers in the hallway and stood there for quite a long time. He sat in his study. He did not make calls. He sat in the chair and he thought about Elena walking back down the aisle, and the thing that came back to him most insistently was not what she had said. He knew what she had said. What he kept returning to was the quality of her movement as she left. The fact that she had not hurried. The fact that there had been no stumble, no sideways glance, no moment of wavering. She had walked back down that aisle exactly the way she had walked in, and the doors had closed, and he had stood at the altar in the silence of 200 people and understood, for perhaps the first time that day, something about who he was dealing with. His phone began receiving messages within the hour. They were not the messages that follow a wedding. They were not photographs from the reception or notes of congratulation or the warm digital stream of a celebration continuing beyond its venue. They were something quieter and more serious, the particular kind of message that arrives when something has gone wrong and the people around you are watching to see how you will respond and have not yet decided what they think of you. Several he could not answer because he did not have words that fit. Several he tried to answer and found the same problem. By evening, Gordon Carter had called. Gordon was his oldest business associate, a man he had known across 15 years and 4 significant deals, a man who spoke plainly and who Alaric had always considered an ally in the practical sense of that word. Gordon's tone on the phone was careful in a way that Alaric was not accustomed to hearing from him, the tone of someone delivering information they would prefer to be delivering differently. He said there was talk. He said the story had moved quickly through certain circles and had arrived, in the same afternoon, at the attention of 2 firms that had been in productive conversation with Alaric about a significant development in the north. He said both firms had indicated, in separate conversations, that they were going to need more time. He said he was telling Alaric this as a courtesy, as a friend, because Alaric should understand the shape of things. Alaric thanked him. He put the phone on the desk. He looked at the window. He tried Celeste. The call went to voicemail. He waited and tried again. Voicemail. He sent a message. He sat in his study and watched the clock move through the evening, and the message did not receive a response. The house was quiet around him, and the flowers Elena had arranged in the hallway were beginning to release their scent into the warm evening air, and he sat with that particular detail, which was more painful than most of the other details, because it was so specific and so completely unnecessary, the flowers of a woman who had expected to come back to this house and had prepared for it. He did not sleep well. The house, which he had always considered a symbol of his position, felt cavernous and incorrectly lit in a way it had not felt before, and he moved through its rooms in the early hours of the morning without purpose, and at some point near 3 in the morning he sat down in the kitchen and did not move for a long time. In the morning, the world had not reset. The messages had continued through the night. When he opened his phone there were more than 20, and they had the character of a narrative being written about him in real time, by people who knew him, who had been present or had heard from those who had been present, and who were in the process of deciding what to do with what they now knew. A dinner invitation that had been confirmed 3 weeks prior was quietly cancelled through his assistant with a brief note and no elaboration. A woman who sat on a charity board he had supported for 4 years sent a message saying she would be stepping back from their planned initiative, worded with the careful courtesy of someone who does not want a conflict but is very clear about their position. Frederick came by mid-morning and sat across from Alaric in the study. He did not begin with sympathy, and Alaric did not expect him to. Frederick was a practical man who operated from the premise that clarity was more useful than comfort, and he was clear. He said the story was being told accurately. He said there was nothing embellished in it because nothing embellished was required. A man had invited the woman he had been privately involved with to his own wedding and seated her prominently. The bride had discovered this on the morning of the wedding, had arrived at the altar, had addressed the congregation, and had left. Frederick said these things without drama because they required none. The facts themselves were sufficient. He said, "This is not something that gets quietly forgotten." Alaric said he wanted to contact Elena. Frederick looked at him. He said, "That may not be the right first step." "Then what is the right first step?" Frederick was quiet. He looked at the window. Then he looked back and said, "Honestly, I don't know." Alaric began trying to reach Elena on the same day. Her personal number did not connect. He tried again the following morning and received the same result. He wrote a letter, a physical letter, which took him longer than he expected because every sentence he put down seemed inadequate in a specific way that was difficult to improve. He sent it to the Vasquez family home because he had no current address for her and did not know when she had changed her phone or where she had gone. He did not know how many steps ahead of him she had placed herself. He did not know, and this bothered him more than he would have expected, how she was or what she was doing or whether she was all right. The letter was not answered. On the fourth day, a formal communication arrived from a legal office. It was brief and courteous and entirely clear in its purpose. Elena Vasquez was represented by a firm called Okafor and Associates, a name Alaric knew by reputation, not a firm that took cases it did not intend to see through to a conclusion it found acceptable. The communication outlined, in precise and measured language, what Elena was seeking and the basis on which she was seeking it. It was not written in the language of anger. It was written in the language of someone who had thought clearly about their position and had retained someone excellent to articulate it. Alaric called his own legal team within the hour. While he was doing that, Celeste Drummond was in the process of becoming invisible. Not to him. He was still waiting for her call. But to the world they had both occupied together, she was withdrawing with the particular efficiency of a person who understands that association with a scandal is itself a form of scandal, and who is intelligent enough to recognize when the best move is to be elsewhere. The gallery opening she had been expected at did not include her. The lunch she had committed to was cancelled with brief apology. Her digital presence, which she had cultivated with considerable attention over several years, went quiet in the space of 48 hours. Not deleted, simply still, like a clock that has stopped without announcement. The people in the circles they shared were completing the arithmetic that had begun in the cathedral. They were looking at what they knew about Celeste and what they knew about Alaric and what Elena had said standing at the altar, and they were arriving at conclusions that required no particular imagination to reach. The conclusions were simply there, available to anyone who looked, and most people who had been in the cathedral that morning were looking. A woman named Patricia Holt, who had attended the Montclair family events for 2 decades and who was regarded in those circles as someone whose assessments were worth noting, said something at a dinner table 4 days after the cathedral. She said it plainly, in the way she said everything, without special weight but with the precision of a person who chooses words deliberately. She said that the only person in that building who had behaved with any dignity was the person who left. This sentence traveled. Alaric heard a version of it from Frederick, who had heard it from Patricia's daughter, who had not mentioned it as news but as an established fact, the way you mention something everyone already knows. Alaric heard it in his study, in the quiet of an afternoon, and he sat with it in a way he had not sat with many things. He thought about Celeste. He thought about the 3 years that had preceded Elena, the particular nature of that arrangement, the way it had continued after Elena had arrived because he had not seriously considered ending it, because ending it had not seemed necessary, because he had not, in the full and honest sense of the phrase, thought about what Elena was owed. He had compartmentalized the 2 things with the ease of a man who is experienced at managing separate truths in separate rooms and had not anticipated the doors opening. The doors had opened. He thought about the seating chart. He had made that arrangement without deliberation. He had placed Celeste where he placed her with the unconscious confidence of a man whose preferences are habitually accommodated, who has not developed the habit of considering the cost of those preferences to other people. He had not thought, when he approved the arrangement, about what it would communicate. He had not thought about it because he had not thought about Elena, not really, not in the way that the arrangement required him to think about her. He understood this now. He had understood it since the moment she turned and walked away from the altar, and the understanding had not become more comfortable in the days since. The legal process moved with the brisk professionalism of something being handled by 2 competent teams operating in the absence of personal animosity. Elena, apparently, had no interest in drama. She had very clear interests of a practical nature and she was pursuing them through the appropriate mechanism with the same efficiency she applied to everything else. Alaric found, as the process moved forward, that this was harder to manage than emotion would have been. Emotion he knew how to navigate. Precision, from a position of moral clarity, was different. He tried once more to reach her. He used Patrick Gray, a man who knew them both and who agreed, after some deliberation, to pass along a message. Patrick called back several days later with the quiet economy of a man delivering an answer he has not embellished. He said Elena had received the message. That she wished Alaric no harm. That she had nothing to say to him that was not already being handled through the appropriate channels. Alaric thanked him. He set the phone down. He sat in the large quiet house in the room where the flowers had been, now long cleared away, and he tried to think about what the next version of his life was going to look like and found that the question was more open than he was accustomed to. He had lived in a world of established position and managed reputation and known quantities, and those things were all still present in his life, but they were present differently now, with a quality of diminishment that he could feel in the texture of his days. Nothing had collapsed. He was not destroyed. But the altitude had changed, and he knew it, and the people around him knew it, and the knowing was its own particular and sustained discomfort. Celeste did not call. She did not call, and the weeks passed, and the fact that she did not call told him something he had been telling himself for some time now that he did not need to hear. He had been wrong about several things. He had been wrong in the specific way of a man who has had everything confirm his instincts for long enough that he has stopped questioning them. He had been wrong about what Elena knew, and what she would do, and what mattered to her, and about the quality of her character. He had placed her, without intending to and without noticing he was doing it, somewhere below his own comfort in the ordering of his considerations. She had placed herself, very clearly and without ambiguity, precisely where she belonged. Spring arrived before Elena was entirely finished being grateful for winter. She had spent the winter months working. Not in the restless, avoidance-driven way of someone who is trying to keep their mind occupied, but in the focused, purposeful way of someone who has a plan and is executing it. The difference between those two kinds of working is significant. One is a distraction. The other is a direction. She had been moving in a direction since the morning she sat in the back of a car and called a legal office, and the movement had not stopped. The apartment was on the third floor of a building that was not interesting from the outside. Inside, it had east-facing windows that admitted the morning light with a quality she found immediately right, a quality she thought of in the vocabulary of her work as the kind of light that shows a room honestly. She had furnished it with the simplicity that is the result of knowing what you actually want rather than what you are supposed to want. A bed. A good desk. A kitchen table with 2 chairs that she had found in a second-hand shop on the high street and had sanded down herself one weekend afternoon, which had been unexpectedly satisfying. Bookshelves that were filling slowly. Nothing extra. Nothing that was there because someone else would have expected it. She slept well in this apartment. Better, she realized with some retrospective clarity, than she had slept in 2 years. The legal process had concluded in the 7th week. Francis Okafor had walked her through every element of it with the combination of directness and steadiness that had made Elena trust her from the first meeting, and the result was what Francis had assessed from the beginning that it would be. Not everything Elena might have claimed had she pursued a more contentious path, but everything she needed. More, in practical terms, than she had walked into that first meeting hoping for. Francis had said, when it was done, that Elena had been an excellent client, and Elena had said, without false modesty, that she had simply been organized, and Francis had said that this was exactly what she meant. The settlement created room. Real, functional room in the financial sense, the kind that changes the options available to a person rather than simply the comfort level within the same constraints. Elena had sat with this for a week before she did anything with it, because she knew her own tendency toward decisive action and wanted to be certain that what she decided was grounded rather than reactive. Then she had opened the files she had been keeping for 2 years and begun making actual plans. The building her grandmother Iris had left her was in a neighborhood that was not yet fully discovered but was in the process of becoming so. Iris Vasquez had been a woman of quiet stubbornness and entirely private wisdom, a person who bought things when they were overlooked and held them when others would have sold, and the building was a product of that philosophy. It was a former storage space attached to a residential property, 2 floors, with windows that were large and generous in a way that someone had thought about when the building was constructed, and a courtyard behind it that had been allowed to overgrow but that Elena could see very clearly as the thing it could become. She had walked through it first at 26, when Iris had still been alive and had taken her there on an afternoon without explanation, just the two of them, the old woman moving slowly through the empty rooms with her hand on the wall as though reading something in the plaster. Elena had stood in the main room and felt the light from the windows and understood immediately what the space wanted to be, in the specific way that certain spaces communicate their potential to the people who know how to listen for it. Iris had watched her standing there and had said nothing. On the drive home she had said, simply, "It will be yours." She had said it the way she said things that were decided. Elena had begun the renovation in the 8th week after the settlement was signed. She had found a builder named Carl through a recommendation from an architect she knew from the firm, and Carl had turned out to be one of the best professional decisions she had made, which was saying something. He was methodical in a way that looked slow and was actually efficient. He asked precise questions and listened to the answers. He did not talk over her or seek to redirect her vision toward what was easier to build. He brought problems to her as information rather than complaints. By the 3rd week Elena had begun to look forward to the morning site visits the way she looked forward to things that are genuinely good. There was a glazier who came to assess the windows in the 4th week and stayed for 2 hours in a conversation about light. His name was Pete and he had the particular enthusiasm of someone who has been doing something for a long time and has not exhausted his interest in it. He and Elena stood in the main room at different times of the afternoon and discussed the angle and quality of the light at each hour and what the window framing could do to maximize or soften it. When he left she made 3 pages of notes and implemented almost all of them. Nina appeared regularly with no specific role and considerable usefulness. She came on weekday evenings when Carl was gone and walked the space with the critical eye she brought to everything, pointing out things Elena had not noticed or had not decided about, asking the questions that needed asking. She did not tell Elena how to do things. She made observations and let Elena think. This was the product of 28 years of knowing Elena and understanding that the most useful thing you can do for her is give her good information and then trust her to use it well. The courtyard was cleared in the 6th week. Underneath the overgrowth was a paved surface in old stone that was better than Elena had expected, and at the south end was a fig tree that had been growing undisturbed for years and had reached the size and disposition of something that considers the space its own. Elena did not argue with this. She built the design of the courtyard around the tree, placing a long wooden table where the afternoon shade fell correctly and adding 2 benches along the wall where climbing plants were beginning to take hold. The courtyard became, of the things she created in the building, the thing she loved most immediately and most simply. She returned to work at the architecture firm in the 9th week. Part-time at first. Her manager Carol had called once during the leave, had asked nothing intrusive, had offered only the practical information that Elena's position would be waiting and that there was no urgency. When Elena came back, Carol updated her on what she had missed in the brisk, efficient tone of someone who understands that the most dignified way to receive someone back is to treat them as though their presence is normal, which is to say, welcome. Her colleagues took the same approach, which she suspected was not spontaneous but organized, in the quiet way these things are sometimes organized by people who are good at them. She was grateful for it. She had not been certain how it would feel to return and she had been prepared for various versions of how it might go. What she encountered was simply her desk, and her work, and the ordinary rhythms of a place that had kept moving in her absence and was happy enough to include her again. She was good at her job. She had always been good at it, and she was better now in ways she found difficult to articulate precisely. Some of the capacity that had been directed, over the past year, toward maintenance, toward the sustained effort of holding something in place that needed to be examined, was now available for other things. She thought more quickly. She solved problems with less friction. She noticed that the quality of her attention in meetings had improved, that she was sharper, more present, less occupied by the background noise of a life she was managing at a cost she had not acknowledged. She heard about Alaric through the particular circuits that carry such information in such worlds. She did not seek it out and she did not avoid it. It arrived when it arrived, and she received it and moved on, which was how she handled most things now. What she heard was consistent. The business difficulties that had begun in the weeks after the cathedral had not resolved cleanly. Several of the partnerships and arrangements that had been in progress had either stalled or concluded in terms that were not what he had anticipated. His profile had altered in ways that were felt rather than announced, the specific kind of shift that comes when the story people tell about you changes. He was not ruined. Nothing as dramatic as that had happened. But the position he had occupied had changed, and he knew it, and it was known by the people around him, and that knowing carried its own sustained weight. She heard that Celeste had withdrawn from their shared world. This surprised her less than it might have. She had understood something about Celeste's character on the morning of the wedding, in the 3 seconds she had looked at her in the second row, that suggested Celeste was not a person who stayed in a situation once it stopped serving her. She did not think very much about either of them. She thought about the building and the light in the main room and what the courtyard would look like in the summer when the climbing plants had taken proper hold of the south wall. She thought about the client she had taken on for a small residential project, a couple in an older house who wanted help reimagining their ground floor, and about the things they had said when she walked the space with them, and about the particular set of problems their home presented that she was finding genuinely interesting to solve. She thought about Grace, the young woman she had brought on as a part-time assistant in November, who was fast and thoughtful and who had framed the publication notice and put it in the entrance of the studio without being asked, which was exactly the kind of initiative Elena valued. The publication notice had arrived in February. A design journal had run a small piece on the consultancy in a section covering new studios worth watching. 1 paragraph. 1 photograph of the main room. A line about what Francis had called quiet authority in the approach. Elena had read it at her kitchen table with her morning coffee and had felt a satisfaction that was clean and proportionate and did not require her to perform anything about it. Carol called to say well done. Nina sent a single line, "I told you so, and I reserve the right to say that forever." Elena sent back a photograph of the courtyard in the morning light and nothing else. The first client referral had come from Carol. The second and third had come from the first client. The fourth had come from someone who had heard about the restaurant project, which had been the kind of work that generated more work, the renovation of a ground-floor dining space for a restaurant reopening under new ownership. A project where Elena had helped them find an identity in the physical space that matched what they were trying to do with the food. The owner had been in the studio the day the first review of the restaurant appeared and had used the word transformed, and Elena had said she preferred the word clarified, and the owner had nodded and said that was better. Grace hired her aunt to help with the courtyard planting in the spring. The aunt was a gardener who worked with the same methodical deliberateness Carl brought to construction, and under her direction the climbing plants on the south wall became what Elena had seen them becoming in her mind since the day she first walked through the courtyard with the overgrowth still uncleared. The fig tree seemed, if this was possible, satisfied. There were difficult evenings. She would not pretend otherwise. There were evenings in the early weeks when the apartment was too quiet and the particular silence of a life that has changed significantly settled in around her with a weight she had to simply sit with rather than move through. There were moments when she thought about the version of the life she had planned, about the house and the routines and the ordinary mornings she had imagined with the kind of careful, measured hope she had allowed herself, and she felt the honest loss of that. Not for Alaric. Not for the person she had eventually and fully understood him to be. But for the hope itself, for the specific quality of optimism she had carried into that life, for the part of herself that had wanted it to be true and had worked, diligently and at some cost, to believe that it was. She allowed herself to feel that loss. She did not give it more space than it warranted, and she did not give it less. She moved forward. The studio occupied its corner with an ease that made it look as though it had always been there, which was the effect Elena had wanted and which Carl had told her, in the dry way he gave compliments, was no accident. The new space was larger than the original building, With the same quality of Eastern light she had come to regard as her particular working atmosphere, and a second room at the back where she and Grace worked side by side with the comfortable efficiency of people who had found a good working rhythm and were not interested in disrupting it. The old building was now home to Hugh's pottery studio. Hugh was a man of about 50 who worked alone and quietly, and who had a habit of bringing things from the kiln to the studio as what he called gratitude, and what Elena thought of as the natural generosity of someone who makes beautiful things and wants them to be used rather than displayed. She had a bowl of his on the kitchen table in the apartment, and a cup she used every morning, and a small dish on her desk that held nothing in particular and gave her pleasure every time she looked at it. The consultancy's reputation had grown with the particular organic momentum of good work properly done and allowed to speak for itself. Elena had not advertised in any formal sense. She did not have a social presence that she maintained for the purpose of attracting business. What she had was a series of completed projects that spoke clearly, and clients who spoke about them, and a quality in the way she worked that made people want to recommend her to the people they cared about. She had not anticipated exactly this shape of growth, but she had hoped for it, in the sense that she had wanted the work to be the thing that led, and it was. She had taken on a young designer named Philip the previous autumn, a graduate with the slightly stunned quality of someone who has just discovered that their formal training and the reality of actual work are different countries. Philip was talented and willing and entirely open to being taught, which was the combination Elena valued most in people who worked with her. He had made significant mistakes in his first 3 months, and she had responded to each of them in the same way, by walking through what had happened, identifying the source, and establishing what would be different the next time. She did not do this gently or harshly. She did it clearly, which was more useful than either. Grace had not been replaced because she had not left. She had moved into a senior role in the same organic way the studio had grown, by doing more of what was needed and doing it well and simply being there consistently. She had organized the studio's first client event in March, a small evening in the courtyard for current and prospective clients, and it had gone with the ease of something that has been prepared for properly. Elena had stood in the courtyard that evening with a glass of water and had watched the space fill with people and conversation and the particular warmth of a good gathering in an outdoor space that is right for it, and she had felt, cleanly and without complication, that she had done something worth doing. Gerald came to the studio 2 or 3 times a year. He came the way he came to most things his daughter did, without announcement and without expectation, simply arriving and walking through and looking with the quiet attention of a man who is measuring something against his own assessment. He never said very much. He asked a question about the work occasionally. Once, standing in the main room at the time of day when the eastern light was at its fullest, he said something about the quality of the space that surprised her, because Gerald Vasquez was not a man who talked about the quality of spaces. He said it felt like the room was interested in the people inside it. She had thought about this for several days afterward. Marguerite came once, with a friend, and sat in the courtyard for an afternoon while Elena worked inside, and at the end of the afternoon she came in and said, in the voice she reserved for things she meant beyond the literal meaning of the words, that it was a very nice place to spend time. Elena had accepted this as the complete endorsement it was. She had not heard from Alaric directly since the legal process concluded. Occasionally, through the circuits that carry information in such worlds, she received news of how he was, which was consistently the same news. Contracted but stable. Present but diminished. Moving through the world he occupied with the particular quality of someone who has lost something they did not fully value until after it was gone and who has not yet found what comes next. She received this information without satisfaction and without sympathy and without spending significant time on it. She had developed, in the year since the cathedral, a very clear sense of where her attention was most productively directed, and Alaric Montclair was not among the most productive destinations. On a Thursday afternoon in late spring, she was at her desk reviewing drawings for a project in the second room when Grace appeared in the doorway and said there was someone asking about availability for a commission. Elena said to give her 5 minutes and she would come out. She finished the note she was making. She closed the drawings folder. She stood up and moved through the studio to the entrance, where a man was standing looking at the framed publication notice on the wall. He turned when he heard her, and she saw that he was perhaps a year or two older than her, with the particular quality of stillness that comes from someone who is comfortable being somewhere without requiring the space to acknowledge them. His name was Daniel Morrow. He had been referred by a client she had worked with the previous year, a recommendation made, he said, in terms that had made him confident enough to make the approach. They sat in the main room and spoke for nearly 2 hours. He had a project that interested her, a former industrial building that he had purchased with a specific sense of what it could be but without the certainty of how to get there. He described it with the combination of vision and honesty about the limits of his vision that she found immediately useful in a client. He asked good questions. He listened to her answers rather than formulating responses while she was still speaking. He had the conversational quality of someone who has learned that you get more from people by being genuinely curious about them than by performing expertise in their direction. When they finished and she walked him to the door, Grace was still at her desk and did not look up immediately, which meant she had been listening and was not going to make it obvious. Elena went back to her desk. She opened a new page in her notebook. She began making notes about the project, the specific and interested notes of someone who is already thinking about how to solve a problem that has genuinely caught their attention. She thought, briefly, about the morning in the cathedral, about the weight of the veil and the sound of the great doors closing and the quality of the light outside as she walked down the steps. She thought about the car and the drive and the call to Francis Okafor. She thought about the wall she had built and maintained and what had been on the other side of it all along. She thought about Iris Vasquez bringing her to the building for the first time and saying, simply, that it would be hers. She thought about the courtyard and the fig tree and Carl and his methodical questions and Grace framing the publication notice without being asked. She picked up her pen. Outside, the afternoon was moving through its ordinary hours in the particular light of late spring, the light that makes everything look slightly better than it is, or perhaps exactly as good as it is. Inside the studio, Elena Vasquez sat at her desk and made notes in the handwriting of a person engaged with what they are doing, which is the handwriting of a person in the right place. She was 30 years old. She had a studio on a corner with good light and a courtyard where a fig tree had opinions. She had work she was good at and people around her who were competent and kind. She had a life that was entirely and precisely hers, arranged according to no one's preferences but her own, built from the ruins of a morning when she had stood in a cathedral and chosen, quietly and without drama, to stop maintaining something that was costing her more than she had ever told herself it was. Daniel Morrow called back the following day. He had thought more about the conversation and had one question he had forgotten to ask during the meeting. She answered it. He said thank you. He paused before ending the call and said that he had liked the studio very much, that it felt like a space built by someone who understood what spaces were actually for. Elena said that was the most useful compliment anyone had given her about it. He said he meant it. They arranged to meet at the industrial building the following week. She told Grace about the meeting that afternoon. Grace said, in the neutral voice she used when she was not being neutral, that he had seemed like someone worth working with. Elena said she thought so too. Grace went back to her screen. Elena went back to her notebook. She thought about what it meant that the 2 years between the morning in the cathedral and this afternoon in the studio could be measured so clearly in the difference between who she had been and who she was now. Not a transformation in the dramatic sense. She was recognizably herself. But the version of herself that existed now moved through the world with a quality of ease that the previous version had not had, because the previous version had been spending a significant portion of its available energy on management. On maintaining the wall. On keeping certain things from being seen clearly, first by herself and then by everyone around her. She was not spending that energy on anything like that now. She was spending it on the work, on the building, on the clients, on Philip's development and Grace's growth and Carl's occasional messages about maintenance and Hugh's bowls and the fig tree and her mother's voice on the phone on Sunday mornings and the quality of the eastern light in the main room at 7 in the morning when she arrived. before anyone else and stood in it for a few minutes before the day began. She was spending it on her life. Her actual life, not the version of it she had been planning in parallel with someone else's needs and preferences. Nina had said, at a dinner the previous month, that she had never seen Elena look so much like herself. Elena had asked what that meant. Nina had considered the question with the seriousness it deserved and then said it meant the version of Elena that existed when Elena was not trying to be a version that would work for someone else. Elena had thought about this for a long time. She thought about it now. She had a call late that afternoon from a new referral, a restaurateur who was opening a second location and wanted advice on the space. She arranged a site visit for the following Thursday. She added it to her calendar, made a preliminary note, and then looked at the full schedule for the next 3 weeks and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who is busy with things they have chosen. Grace left at 5:30 and said goodnight from the door without looking back, the way people do when they are comfortable in a place and do not need to perform their departure. Philip had left an hour earlier, having asked 3 good questions about the Industrial Building Commission before going. Elena sat alone in the studio as the light changed from afternoon to early evening, the eastward light dimming and the room taking on the quality of early dusk, warm and slightly amber. She looked around the space. The framed notice on the wall. Hugh's bowl on the reception table holding a few dried stems Nina had brought from a market 2 weeks before. The plans drawer Carl had built into the back room. The door to the courtyard, which was open, through which she could hear the faint city sounds and the occasional movement of the fig tree in the end-of-day breeze. She thought about Iris Vasquez, who had brought her to the original building when she was 26 and had said it would be hers. She wondered if Iris had known, in the particular way of old people who observe more than they speak, something about what the building would need to become before it became what it was. Whether she had understood that her granddaughter would need to arrive at it from a specific direction, by a specific road, and that the road would be hard but would deposit her exactly where she needed to be. She thought this was probably giving too much credit to fortune-telling. She thought Iris had simply believed in her. That was the most likely explanation and also the most sufficient. She closed her notebook. She turned off the desk lamp. She collected her bag and walked through the studio to the door, pausing at the courtyard to pull it closed, looking at the table and the fig tree in the late light for a moment before she did. She walked home through the warm evening of a city in late spring, through streets that were loud and unhurried and alive with the specific and unmanaged energy of a city at the end of a working day. She bought bread from the bakery on the corner below her apartment. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. She opened the windows to the evening air. She made dinner. She sat at the kitchen table in the light of the long spring evening and ate, and looked at the window, and thought about the industrial building and what it wanted to be, and let the thoughts move through her in the useful, generative way they moved when she was not trying to direct them too forcefully. Later she called her mother. They spoke for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, which is to say about everything that mattered. The particular gift of a conversation between 2 people who know each other completely and do not require it to be about anything specific in order for it to be everything necessary. She said goodnight. She went to bed. She slept well. She was not finished. She had barely started, in the way that people who are building things are never finished, are only at various stages of what comes next. She knew this about herself and it did not worry her. Forward motion was something she had always been good at. She turned the page in her notebook and kept writing. The city moved through its afternoon around her, indifferent and full of its own business, as cities always are, and in a studio on a corner in a neighborhood that was becoming interesting, a woman worked in good light with the unshowy satisfaction of someone who is exactly where she is supposed to be. She had walked out of a cathedral on the morning of her wedding, and the world had not ended. It had, very quietly, begun.